Have you ever watched one of those high-energy motivational talks? The kind that fills the room with thunderous applause and leaves you walking out thinking, this is it. This time everything changes. For a few hours, or maybe even a couple of days, you feel unstoppable. You write out your goals. You set alarms for 5 a.m. You tell yourself that the past is behind you and the future is yours to build. It's electric. It's euphoric. It feels like rebirth. But then something happens. The fire starts to fade. You snooze the alarm. You skip the journal entry. You start avoiding that to-do list you made in a burst of inspiration. And before you know it, you're back where you started. Or worse, you're feeling even more disappointed in yourself than before. And now the voice in your head isn't a coach. It's a critic. It whispers, see? You're just lazy. You're not disciplined. You're not like them. But what if that voice is lying? What if the problem isn't that you're broken or weak or unworthy of change? What if the real issue is that you've been emotionally hijacked? You were pulled into a dopamine high that was never meant to last, an artificial surge of motivation without any roots in your inner life. This is what I call the self-help crash. It's not talked about much because it doesn't sell books, but it's real and it's brutal. Here's what's really happening. Motivational content, especially the high-energy guru-style stuff, activates the reward centers of your brain. It gives you a neurochemical hit, not unlike sugar or a short burst of social media validation. You feel temporarily elevated, empowered, even transcendent. But then your brain does what it always does after a dopamine spike. It crashes. And in that low, instead of recognizing the pattern, you blame yourself. You assume the failure is personal, but it's not. This is where the ideas of Carl Jung become absolutely essential. Jung didn't believe that lasting transformation comes from hype or external inspiration. He believed that real change begins in the darkest corners of the psyche, in what he called the shadow. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Most self-help skips right over it. Instead of helping you face the unconscious, the shadow, the repressed side of your being, motivational content tends to amplify what Jung would call the persona, the social mask, the curated version of yourself that looks strong, capable, and successful on the outside. But no mask can hide you from yourself. When your motivation crashes, when your old patterns return, what you're really experiencing is the revolt of the unconscious. It's not that you're not trying hard enough. It's that you're trying to build a new self while ignoring the parts of you that have never been acknowledged, healed, or integrated. Jung warned us, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That inner sabotage you keep experiencing, that voice that pulls you back into old habits and insecurities, that's not fate. That's the shadow speaking. You don't need more motivation. You don't need another routine, another affirmation, another early morning hustle. What you need is courage, not the kind that screams in front of a crowd, but the kind that dares to look inward, the kind that asks, what part of me have I been running from? Because the truth is, you're not weak, you're not broken. You've just been taught to ignore the very part of yourself that holds the key to your transformation. And as long as you keep chasing quick hits of inspiration without facing the depth of your own psyche, you'll keep getting stuck in the same loop. High, crash, guilt, repeat. But what happens when you stop chasing the light and start turning toward the dark? That's where we go next. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing. This journey inward is just getting started. But before we can even begin to face the shadow, we have to understand the mask we wear to avoid it. In Jungian psychology, that mask has a name, the persona. The persona isn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's necessary. It's the version of ourselves we present to the world, the role we play to fit into society, to be accepted, to survive. It's how we show up at work, in public, on social media. It's the curated self, the polished self, the together self. But the danger is this. When you confuse the persona for who you really are, you lose touch with the deeper, more complex truth of your being. And that's exactly what most motivational content unknowingly encourages. Self-help doesn't teach you how to become your truest self. It teaches you how to become the version of yourself that gets applause. You're not told to face your fears. You're told to conquer them. You're not encouraged to feel your sadness. You're told to reframe it. You're not guided inward. You're propelled outward, toward status, toward productivity, toward becoming the kind of person that looks unshakable from the outside. The image that motivational gurus promote is seductive. Fearless, focused, high-performing, emotionally untouchable. They give you a checklist for confidence, a blueprint for power, a system to finally become your best self. But let's ask the harder question. Who defines what best means? Usually, it's the culture, and the culture rewards what it can measure: output, success, charisma, likability. So what you're really being trained to become is a high-functioning persona, a perfect mask. And ironically, the better you get at playing that role, the more disconnected you become from the self, the part of you that's messy, raw, contradictory, and deeply human. Carl Jung wrote, "The persona is a system of behavior that is only partially real. It's a compromise between the individual and society." In other words, it's not a lie, but it's not the whole truth either. The more we invest in the persona, the more we silence the parts of ourselves that don't fit the role. Our anger, our fear, our longing, our grief, all of it gets shoved behind the curtain where it festers. And here's the catch. The more convincing your mask becomes, the more exhausting it is to maintain. Because deep down, this isn't all of you. This is why so many people who dive into the self-help world eventually burn out. They build a polished version of themselves, but it's fragile. It's not rooted in the self. It doesn't have depth. And when life inevitably shakes them, because it always does, the persona cracks. And what's underneath feels foreign, unprocessed, unacknowledged. Research by Dr. Brené Brown supports this. Her studies on shame and perfectionism show that the more we strive to be perceived as enough by external standards, the more we internalize the belief that we are fundamentally lacking. This perfectionism doesn't lead to excellence. It leads to anxiety, self-doubt, and emotional fatigue. So here's the paradox. The more you chase becoming your best self according to external models, the more distant you become from the self that actually matters. The persona can help you survive. It can even help you succeed, but it cannot help you feel whole. And if you're wondering why, after all your effort, you still feel like something is missing, maybe it's because the part of you that longs to be seen isn't your persona, it's yourself. And it's still waiting for you behind the mask. So what happens when we stop trying to improve the mask and instead start listening to the voice beneath it? That's where we go next. But once you see the mask for what it is, you have a choice. Keep polishing it or start looking underneath. And that's where things get uncomfortable. Because what lives beneath the persona is something far more chaotic, far more human, and far more real. Carl Jung called it the shadow. And if you've never heard a motivational guru talk about it, that's no accident. The shadow is everything you've been taught to hide. It's your anger, your envy, your self-doubt, your craving for validation, your quiet despair. It's not evil, it's just exiled. It's the parts of yourself you were told were too much, too dark, or too weak to show. So you buried them. You smiled when you were supposed to be angry. You said, "I'm fine," when you were anything but. You told yourself to stay positive when what you really needed was to scream. Over time, this creates a split inside you. The acceptable parts go out into the world wearing a smile, while the rest gets locked away in the dark, festering, growing, waiting. And here's the dangerous part. The more you suppress your shadow, the more power it gains. Motivational culture, for all its glittering optimism, doesn't help here. In fact, it often makes things worse. You're told to reframe your pain, to find the lesson, to vibrate higher. You're taught that everything negative is a mindset problem, that sadness is just a lack of gratitude, that anger is just misplaced energy, that fear is just resistance to growth. But what if that's not true? What if your shadow isn't something to be transcended, but something to be integrated? What if it's not a weakness, but a signal, a part of you that's been screaming to be heard? Ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. In fact, the more you run from it, the more it sabotages you. It shows up in your procrastination, in your addictions, in your toxic relationships, and quiet anxiety. It shows up in that emptiness you feel after the high of a new habit wears off. It shows up in that voice that whispers, "This isn't working," even when you're doing everything the gurus told you to do. This is the inner rebellion. This is the shadow's revenge. And if you've ever felt burned out by self-improvement, if you've ever hit that wall where the books, the videos, the planners, the routines suddenly stop working, you're not alone. Psychologists now recognize a phenomenon called self-improvement fatigue. It's a real psychological burnout that comes from constantly trying to fix yourself without ever addressing the parts of you that are asking to be accepted, not corrected. You reach a point where every new tool feels hollow. Every new morning routine feels like a performance. And deep down, you're exhausted, not because you're lazy, but because you're carrying the weight of everything you've been told not to feel. Jung warned us, what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. The shadow doesn't go away because you ignore it. It goes underground, and from there, it runs the show. The irony is painful. The more obsessed you become with becoming your best self, the more disconnected you become from your whole self. And without that wholeness, change doesn't stick. Motivation fades, willpower cracks, and the old patterns creep back in. So if you've been stuck in a cycle of trying harder and feeling worse, maybe it's time to stop asking, "What more can I do?" and start asking, "What part of me have I left behind?" Because your shadow isn't the enemy. It's the wounded part of you waiting to be brought back into the light. And that's exactly where we go next. So what happens when we ignore the shadow, suppress it, and try to build a better life without it? We enter a trap, a loop, a psychological hamster wheel that promises transformation but delivers exhaustion. This is the paradox at the heart of modern self-help. The more you try to change without facing what's hidden inside you, the more stuck you become. It goes like this. A motivational guru tells you the reason you're not successful yet is because you're not disciplined enough. You don't wake up early enough. You don't want it badly enough. So you double down. You buy another planner. You stack more habits. You wake up at 5 a.m., drink the green juice, and repeat affirmations into the mirror like a spell. But eventually, you slip. You skip a day. You fall off the wagon, and the shame hits. Now you're not just tired, you're guilty. You think, maybe I'm just not cut out for this. And in that vulnerable moment, what do? You go back to the source, another book, another podcast, another hit of motivation, and the cycle begins again. What you're caught in is not self-improvement, it's self-abandonment. Because if you're constantly trying to fix yourself through external means without addressing the internal fractures, the change won't hold. It can't. It's like painting over a cracked wall without ever touching the foundation. On the surface, things look better, but underneath, the structure is still unstable. And here's where the loop becomes even more insidious. The harder you try, the more you believe that failure is a moral flaw. Not just I failed, but I am a failure. And that belief makes you even more dependent on someone else's system to feel worthy. You become a follower of methods, a disciple of productivity, but none of it is yours. You're living a script written by someone else, for someone else's idea of what success should look like. Friedrich Nietzsche had a name for this. He called it slave morality, a way of life defined not by your own values, but by the values imposed on you by others. You're not chasing your truth, you're chasing approval. You're performing for a scoreboard you didn't design. And the more obedient you become to that scoreboard, the more you lose touch with your own inner compass. Carl Jung saw this coming. He warned us that transformation is not about eradicating the shadow or pretending it doesn't exist. It's about turning toward it, facing it, listening to it. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That's the work. Not adding more light, but understanding the dark. Not ignoring the wounded parts of yourself, but asking them what they've been trying to say all along. This isn't about abandoning discipline or goals. It's about shifting the foundation. Instead of asking, "How can I become more perfect?" you start asking, "Which part of me have I left behind in my pursuit of perfection?" Real growth doesn't begin with a new routine. It begins with a reckoning, a moment of radical honesty, a willingness to sit with your contradictions and recognize that you're not supposed to be flawless. You're supposed to be whole. And once you break that loop, once you stop trying to escape your shadow and instead start dialoguing with it, everything changes. Because now your growth isn't built on shame, it's built on truth. And that truth will carry you further than any morning routine ever could. So where do we go from here? We stop performing change, and we start embodying it. By embracing not just the light in us, but the darkness too. Because only then can we begin the real work of becoming whole. So what happens when you finally break the loop? When you stop trying to fix yourself and start listening to what your inner life has been whispering all along? That's when something profound begins. A shift not toward perfection, but toward wholeness. Not toward becoming someone better, but someone truer. This is what Carl Jung called individuation. Individuation isn't about self-improvement. It's not about goals, hacks, or becoming the best version of yourself. In fact, it's the opposite. It's about becoming the version of yourself that you've always been, underneath the masks, the roles, the projections. It's the long, often uncomfortable process of integrating the persona, the ego, and the shadow, so that for the first time, you stop performing your identity and start embodying it. This process doesn't happen on a stage. It doesn't happen in a seminar room filled with applause. It happens in silence, in solitude, in the quiet hours when you're finally honest with yourself. It doesn't look like success. It looks like sitting with grief, confronting your fears, owning your anger. It's the moment you stop trying to be good and start trying to be real. And here's the hard truth. No guru can walk that path for you. No checklist can substitute for it. There's no shortcut, no guaranteed outcome. Because individuation is not about getting somewhere. It's about coming home to what's already inside you. Jung understood this. He wrote not to help people become positive thinkers or winners, but to help them become whole. He believed that real transformation begins the moment you stop running from your darkness and start integrating it into your story. And in doing so, you move beyond the shallow identity that culture rewards and toward a deeper self that can't be measured or marketed. Erich Fromm echoed this in his own words. The quest for certainty blocks the search for meaning. Uncertainty is the very condition to impel man to unfold his powers. He believed that true freedom lies in being, not having, not in owning achievements, but in owning your truth. And that kind of freedom isn't flashy. It's not easily packaged. It's often quiet, raw, and deeply personal. Think about the people who've truly transformed, not through hype, but through depth. Carl Jung himself went through a profound psychological crisis in his midlife that shattered his old identity and forced him to reconstruct himself from the inside out. Fyodor Dostoevsky didn't become who he was through success, but through suffering, prison, loss, and the radical honesty those experiences demanded. These weren't men who crushed their goals. They were men who descended into themselves and emerged with insight. And maybe you felt it too, that faint pull towards something deeper, that quiet knowing that the life you've been chasing might not be the one that actually fulfills you, that perhaps your healing doesn't lie in adding more, but in peeling things away. This is the heart of individuation. It's not about building a better mask. It's about removing the mask altogether. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. And it's only from that place, raw, integrated, real, that lasting peace, power, and purpose can emerge. So no, you don't need to become someone great. You just need to become someone whole. And that journey doesn't begin with ambition. It begins with truth. And next, we talk about what that truth actually looks like in practice. So how do you begin this journey? How do you stop drowning in self-help advice and start reconnecting with the self that's been buried underneath years of performance and perfectionism? First, let's be clear. This is not an attack on self-help. The desire to grow, to heal, to improve, it's deeply human and often noble. But like any tool, it depends on how you use it. Blindly consuming advice, following formulas, or chasing ideals that don't belong to you, that's not growth. That's avoidance disguised as ambition. What we need now is not more advice, but more awareness. Not motivation, but meaning. Not performance, but presence. So if you're feeling stuck in the cycle, if you're tired of chasing change that doesn't stick, here are 3 ways to begin the real work. Not as a checklist, but as invitations back to yourself. 1. Begin a shadow journal. This isn't about writing affirmations. It's about honesty, raw, uncomfortable, liberating honesty. Start recording the thoughts you usually censor. The jealousy, the rage, the shame, the loneliness, the parts of you you've labeled wrong or ugly. Not to judge them, but to witness them. You're not writing a manifesto. You're letting your shadow speak. Over time, you'll start to see you are not your impulses and you are not your filters. You are the one who can hold both. Second, practice silent days. Carve out a day, even half a day, where you disconnect from noise. No podcasts, no phones, no input, just stillness. Because silence is where the shadow emerges. When you stop distracting yourself, the deeper layers of your psyche have space to breathe. And in that silence, things you've been avoiding will rise to the surface, not to hurt you, but to be seen, felt, and eventually integrated. The silence isn't empty, it's full of the truth you've been too busy to hear. 3. Ask, whose dream am I chasing? This question might shake you. That's okay. Ask yourself honestly, the success you've been striving for, the career, the image, the lifestyle, is it yours? Or was it handed to you by culture, family, or fear? So many people spend their lives climbing ladders only to realize they were leaning against the wrong wall. Individuation means building a life rooted in your own values, not inherited expectations. And that requires pausing long enough to tell the difference. Because at the end of the day, the goal is not to defeat your shadow. It's not a monster to slay. It's a part of you to reclaim. Integration, not elimination, is the path forward. And when you do this work, something powerful happens. You stop living in fragments. You stop chasing borrowed dreams. You stop mistaking the mask for the man. Instead, you begin to live from your center, not perfectly but authentically. And that is where true strength is born. So if you've made it this far, if something in this resonated, know this: you're not broken, you're not behind. You're just being invited to wake up. Not to the person you wish you were, but to the wholeness of who you already are. And that is not the end of your journey. It's the first honest beginning.